Hey everybody, and welcome to a brand new episode of Ms. Pinky Thoughts. I am your host, Nicole Pinkston, and I am so glad that you guys could join me today. And if you guys are listening to us through our audio stuff over at Spotify and Apple, we are glad to have you as well. We are back with our live episodes where we're bringing on guests in our new iconic branch of Miss Pinky Thoughts. And I'm just so glad because we are branching out and we're doing so much more. Before we introduce our guests, I just want to let you guys know that we are starting our new iconic media, and our audience are called Icons. I never gave you guys a, a name for over 7 years. And what we're doing over at Iconic Media is trying to empower each and every one of you guys in life, love, marriage, and family. And we just wanted to do something again and, do something more personal one-on-one where you guys can see my pretty face and match it to the voice and, something more personal. Always, we have free access to MsPinkyThoughts.substack.com. You can come over there, chop it up with us, chat. We have interactive chat, we have comment section, and you can just spread our message around. We're trying to rebrand and rebuild us in life, marriage, family, and everything wholesome. And our guest today is Greg Bulla. We're doing his book, For Their Own Good. Oh, and he's also an icon too. And you have seen some of his work over at Iconic, and we'll get more into that later. But Greg, how are you doing today?
I am pretty good. I hope you are too.
Oh, awesome. I just made some lasagna soup and, took care of the family. I had to do it up with a little cornbread on the side. I think I put it over there on Twitter. All of the information from today's show is going to be in the show notes. So if anybody want to find me or find Greg or find both of us, because we always together some kind of way, they can read at the bottom of the show. And if you're listening to this again, audio wise, it will be in the audio notes as well. So Greg, I had you on this show, I think twice, or this is your third time or your second time?
I think it's the second time. Yeah.
Second time. And the first time I think we did your first book, you became an author like me. I got the Iconic collection just sitting over there because some people think that it's like just digits or they don't think it's real.
No, it's real.
5 books. Got your copy. But so we had our conversation about from where I stand, your first book, and I want people to go into the comment section and watch that video. We're not going to rehash everything from that episode, but tell us a little bit how you got either swindled by Coach, or what was your thought process of, oh my God, I got a first book out. I'm so excited and I'm ready to do another one.
Well, getting that first book out, I mean, all through like grade school, early grades, I wanted to be a writer, write books and stories and so forth. And, I've always looked at it like I'm way overdue for making something like this happen, but getting involved with Coach, was the first time I had like that close of access to somebody who would really push that and then say, okay, here's how you can do it and so forth. And then once I got engaged in that process, it was easy. The first book was fairly easy in the respect that it was just like, okay, draw on your own experience. What happened this phase in your life and that phase. And then when it came to the second one, it was just like the idea pops in my head after she's like, when do you want to do your next book? As soon as the first one's done. And I was like, hey, wait a minute. What about, books, book bans and restrictions and so forth. So, and of course, that lit the candle, and she was off and running, working with me on that. And there we are.
All right, we're going to get into a little bit deeper about your book. That was how you came up with the second book. You were just in the writing process with Coach being our publisher, and she was just asking you and picking your brain. But how did you come up with the book banning topic? I mean, you could have wrote about anything, but you decided, I guess with the controversies that's going on with whether or not books are being banned in schools, or take us through the process of how you decided that would be your topic and how you thought about tackling on it.
Well, a lot of the stuff I'd been writing about up to that point with articles and such were related to history. And that, plays into this a little bit, but there were a lot of high profile cases around books being banned from school libraries, classrooms, and curriculums and so forth. So I started thinking about that because a lot of it was touching on like, authentic American history and Black authors and so forth. And they were getting lumped in with a lot of different categories where it didn't really belong as far as grounds for any restrictions placed on it. And that kind of, in line with everything I'd, been in the process of learning more about with authentic history, kind of made me think, you know what, as much as I've always loved books and having access to books and not being restricted from any kind of book, this is something I would really like to explore a little more and kind of share my thoughts about it.
Awesome. Can you define for the audience today that might be listening, might be concerned for their children that's going to school and seeing certain kind of books? Exactly. How did you define? Excuse me. There's something going on outside. For anybody who's hearing that background noise, I apologize for that. I don't know what's going on there, and I'm gonna stay right here. But hopefully, it won't be too distracting from what we got going on. But back to what we were talking about, your book. So how did you define book banning in the beginning, and how do you define book banning before we get into, all of the different types of bans or what is going on today?
Well, the way I look at it, book banning is not just the straight up like this book can't be found anywhere anymore at all. It was more like any restriction to access, limitation to access for books that were previously available. And as I was doing some research, I saw that, the definition on PEN America's site, they kind of shared the same thing along those same lines. It's not literally that you can't get the book anymore. Sure, you can get all of these books in stores, Barnes and Noble, what have you. But when the access to those is restricted and limited from what it once was, it is a limitation on that knowledge, and it is some form of a ban.
So even if parents are saying that they don't want that sexually explicit material being conveyed to their children, you still consider it a ban because it's limiting the kids to have access to these types of books?
I think just literally not just any type of book, just the whole process of limiting their access to that book, whatever the theme is.
Can you take us a little bit through the history of banning? Let's go back a little bit because we're talking more about, Florida law
Mhm.
and a lot of the things that's happening, like with Moms for Liberty and other groups that are been speaking out at these school board meetings. But let's
Mhm.
back up a bit because we know books like Huckleberry Finn and things like
Mhm.
that have been on the chopping block, and we have actually talked about some banning books when we were doing the book club with
Right.
Conscious Conservative. So take us back to as early as you mentioned in your book, at least, or in your own mind growing up. What did book ban look like, or what did you experience at those times?
Well, a lot of the earliest book bans go back into like the 50s and 60s. And one of the books that we talked about, you mentioned the book club, was To Kill a Mockingbird. And one of the earliest challenges to that book came back in 1966. And that and other books like The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, a lot of the issues that were had with those were the language and, the terminology used in there, especially along the lines of race and racial relations and so forth. A little bit different than what we're seeing now, where it's like there's a political motive behind it. It's not just like this whole ideological, we want to keep our kids away from um, adult material and so forth.
What do you mean necessarily ideological? Do you believe that they're targeting certain specific groups and books, or oh, it has to be on the left or it has to be on the right, and they're not just doing an all over ban?
I think it's the ideological in the respect that they come at it like we're worried about our children's education and we want to give them a quality education, and these books won't meet that requirement for us. That's the ideological piece. And as far as what kind of books, a lot of they are attacking some of those books that are I guess you could say pornographic or adult related. I see that terminology used rather than so much specific titles. If you look at The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison, which is a widely banned book, a lot of the challenges cite content of violence and child rape, which that is featured in the book, but they use that to define the entire book as a reason to get it banned when that's something that occurs in the book near like 80 to 85% into the book, and there's a much greater context already established for the main character's story by that point. So you can't really just boil that book down to that one moment and say it should be banned because of this content and ignore everything else. And I think one thing that they're missing with that is there's a difference between we're going to remove it from the libraries, the classrooms, and the curriculums, or hey, it's more age appropriate or grade level appropriate for, say, AP in high school as opposed to, like, say, a middle school book or below. That I don't consider a ban anyway. I think that's just more like, okay, you're aligning the learning resources where they're most appropriate for the child's learning journey.
So do you think the people who are arguing that it is a ban are arguing not for the material itself, but more so about the restriction aspect of it? And do you think they want some kind of like scale like we use for movies or video games?
That's not something that I saw in a lot of the cases. They're not arguing for it. Let's put this system in place. They're arguing for, let's take this out. So with a lot of the cases, what happens is, a challenge is filed against the book and it comes off the shelves in the classrooms, the libraries or whatever for a certain period of time until the case is settled and whatnot. And what I read about in a few is that, that might drag on for 2, 3 or more months, or that book might be unavailable to students for at least half of a school year or more. And then the summer vacation hits and then it's maybe the next fall it's back.
Have you seen discussion with parents and administrators and even the Library Association about the type of books and how it applies to the curriculum itself, and whether or not these books actually are conducive to even learning? Like, does the child actually have to read this book to pass certain classes to meet graduation requirements? Like, have they actually been discussing it from, an educational standpoint and, saying maybe they can just wait till college or such other kind of discussions that might, you touched on in your book? Sorry.
I've seen cases where there's questions over whether it should be on a required reading list or if parents should be given an alternative to that book. And I don't think I don't have any issues with that, because you still have the option. Okay, you don't want to read this book, you don't feel like it's appropriate, here's another book. That book's still available to the rest of the students, and that student too, if later on something changes and the parents have a change of heart, what have you, the book is still available. But I think that's a fair option in that regard. And I've seen more discussions around, should it be on a required reading list, required reading, or required in the curriculum, more so than anything else.
Have you seen pushback or even concerns from authors' standpoint, from people who are actually writing these books and publishing these books, or even as an author yourself? Do you have any questions you asked or posed in your novel about it from a writer's standpoint of how we should censor or freedom of speech, anything like that?
Some of the articles I read, there were a few writers that weighed in on it. Of course, their concern was the censorship aspect of it. A lot of the feedback that I was seeing in all the articles about challenges and new laws and so forth, the main concerns were coming from library staff and even some parents, but a lot of library staff and teachers, because there are certain laws that are going to be set up where if they're found to have this objectionable material around, they could be guilty of a federal offense.
Like a child CP law or something like that?
Yeah, there was one law, I think it was a Missouri law. I don't have the bill number handy, but, it was detailing a lot about like child sex trafficking and so forth. Nothing related to like books and objectionable material in a book. But there was like a piece of that got added on in the 11th hour of the process of developing the bill that centered around objectionable material, like in libraries and so forth. And it kind of set those librarians and that staff up where if, they're found guilty of not, adhering to these monitoring guidelines, then, they could be guilty of an offense.
Have you seen any of this more organically, or did it just seem like it came left field? I know we know about book banning, like Hitler's book and a Communist Manifesto and things like
Mm-hmm.
that. And you already mentioned earlier that a lot of books were banned based on racial language and sexually charged things. But it seems like this has just sprouted up over the last couple of years. And we are in election season,
Mm-hmm.
but there are concerned parents that are worried about what their children are learning. So do you think that this was more organic or a combination of political here, a little social there?
I don't think it was so much organic as it was like political ish oriented. That's where like PEN America was citing where they're seeing a lot of the sources of these are from like activist groups and some small groups of parents, because PEN America found that there were a large portion of parents, especially in those red states where a lot of the book ban type regulations are coming forth, that were not in favor of it. So it's not like it's a widespread grassroots, you know, support group in favor of these bans. And, look back over the years. I mean, sure, those challenges pop up here and there, but not so much in such a short period of time over, like, I'd say probably the last 6, 7 years.
I've seen somewhere where people are starting to talk about the literacy rate, and
Mm-hmm.
they starting to discuss how our American literacy. I noticed it because I discussed it a couple months ago in one of my newsletters, and I didn't really see too much. And then it felt like people wanted to shift a little bit from the negative scandals and stuff that are going
Mm-hmm.
on with certain groups. So now they want to bring up, oh, people across America can't read. People across the country are having difficulty reading. Do you think these bans and this heightened sense of attention to our reading material is affecting or correlating to our actual literacy rates and how often kids are reading in the regular everyday curriculum? Or do you think that's two totally different things?
I think that all of this attention to the book ban has brought up the literacy rate and it's drawn more attention to it. I don't think the book ban itself affects the literacy rate. I think that's a little bit deeper, but so much focus on making sure this book is not available in this library takes away attention that should be devoted towards a literacy rate. Because when you've got parents who didn't learn to read or become strong readers, they tend to have children who follow suit. So you've got like this legacy of poor literacy rates. And that article that you mentioned, I mentioned that near the end of my book, where, a lot of the highest or the lowest rather literacy rates are in red states that also lead in book bans. Not to say that, hey, you're making your kids poor readers because you're trying to ban books. It's like you're focusing on the wrong thing.
Yeah, you should probably be focusing more if they can read
Yes.
or not about what they're reading, because they probably can't read that at this point. But not to take light of illiteracy,
Mm-hmm.
it's a very big problem, and I'm seeing
Exactly.
it across the political lines. It's in red and blue areas, and parents in rural or urban areas are both struggling with trying to be there. And do you think we're leaning too much on trying to get the government and the school system to fix these bans and not indoctrinate our kids, and the parents ourselves are not actually stepping up? I know you have a child and I have two.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that a lot of the issues with the books is not so much of what's being put in the schools, but not as much involvement from parents?
I think that could be it. I mean, I don't want to be the one to say that Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you need to be doing more, because I don't know what their situation is. I
Yeah.
mean, I grew up, I'm a 70s baby and an 80s kid, so it was a different story. It was like, for a long time, we were a one-car family. So my mom drops my dad off at work, drops me off at school. So it's, whereas together as a unit so much more, going in one direction, one place at a time. But nowadays, you've got one parent going this way, this one's got this sport to do and that after school activity. And it's really hard for a lot of families, I think, to make that happen, just to kind of look at it at a high level. And I'm sure there's a lot of different circumstances depending on a family situation. So I think that's something to keep in mind. But, I don't want to like ding parents, because I know how that is.
I kind of set you up for failure with that question because I feel like the discussion about the book bans is more so much not what is being read, but by this ideological thing that conservatives are not for banning thought or banning speech. And then they got a gotcha look at you guys trying to censor stuff over here.
Mm-hmm.
And then the conservatives are like, wait, we're conservatives, we're traditional. Why would we have explicit materials in our books? And so now we having these clashes of principles versus action, and they tried to get a gotcha because you got, Governor Newsom reading. I'm sorry, the book is eluding me right now, but there's a picture of him just. It's To Kill a Mockingbird,
Mm-hmm.
and he has it sitting there. He's looking at it, but I'm like, To Kill a Mockingbird was already banned, so that's not the book that they're targeting. But
Yeah, I mean
it's
that's gone through it, and that's like how something that was so awful back in the day. Like, think about how 1950s shows, when there was a married couple, they always slept in different beds.
yes,
But now you see them like they're at least sleeping in the same bed. That's something that was so taboo once upon a time. Now it's not. Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, To Kill a Mockingbird were once like, oh my gosh, that book is a problem, and now it's just like, eh. And that's the
well,
kind of attitude I grew up with in grade school and all through high school. When I would hear about, oh, The Catcher in the Rye, oh gosh, yeah, that used to be banned everywhere and so forth. And To Kill a Mockingbird, I'm like, we read that in 8th grade AG English class. I'm like, what?
and I want to lean more onto the second part of your book because you have a larger title. I know I just keep saying that it's for their own good.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to lean more into the second half of our conversation into the freedom of thought portion of your book. Because I know when we're taught or coached into writing our books, we try to deliver a message for our readers. In each one of my books, just like your first book, tries to present, okay, what do we do now? Are we banning all of the books? Are we, picking and choosing which books? Is,
Mm-hmm.
the school have to read every single book that come through and then evaluate it like that? How have you seen this like kind of infiltrate? You said freedom of thought, and I put that as a little blurb far as the title of this episode. How do you see this conflicting with that ideology?
Well, the whole thing with freedom of thought, I mean, when you look at a book like, let's use 1984 as an example,
Mm-hmm.
once a heavily restricted banned book, not so much now, but freedom of thought was one of the concepts that was really attacked because it was critical of government organizations and so forth. But now the way I see it with so many of these fiction titles, like again Toni Morrison's book, for instance, I think it's freedom of thought that's being attacked because you don't get the ability to go in depth and engage in some analytical thinking to understand deeper than what you see on the surface of the words on the page. So if you are, and this is where I go back to the grade level appropriateness, like say an AP English class, for instance, if you're studying the bluest eye, that curriculum is going to be a little more rigorous, and you're going to have the ability as an educator to go a little more deeply into detail on some of the issues and say, okay, yeah, this was happening in the book, but what else? What does it really mean? What's going on here? Right? So you look at Bluest Eye and Pecola, there were 3 prostitutes that lived upstairs, up above their family. So you think, oh, a moral issue. They're showing prostitutes hanging around kids. Those 3 were more of a mother to her and cared for her more than her own mother did. So look at that. That's a whole nother issue that Toni Morrison's writing about there. But when you just look at like, oh, adult material pornography and violence and so forth, and say that book belongs on a banned list, that's a restriction on freedom of thought and expression.
So, like, we've been naming a bunch of books. Like, I was reading Napoleon Hill's book, Outwitting the Devil, and that book actually wasn't even published until 2011 because his family and everybody was scared about his religious implications, and he was attacking the school system, and just they was like, nah, we're not going to have it. And then they got to where they pushed it out in 2011. And I feel like there is some convolution going here of what is actually people are having an issue with versus where lines should be drawn. And when you were talking about appropriate age level, it made me think, as a homeschooling mom, my son is 6th grade reading level, and I wanted to give him some pushback, and I wanted to
Mm-hmm.
give him Animal Farm. But then when I looked at some of the curriculum online, they don't really give Animal Farm until a little bit later, so they can get through history and explain a little bit about communism, socialism, just monarchies and all the other political ideologies, so you can
Right.
understand what the pigs are doing. You can't understand what's actually happening with the animals, the taking over and everything, if you don't
And
you get what I'm saying.
yeah, and Animal Farm was another one. I mentioned that in the book too, but that's kind of unique because that's one of those books where the nature of it, since the main characters are animals, you
Mm-hmm.
can teach that to a younger kid in a certain way where he or she is going to get it appropriate to their level of where they're at, cognitively developed, so forth at this point. And then once, I think we read that in 8th grade as well. So at that level, or even high school level, you can speak about it in a different way because, you can think of it for a younger student in terms of right and wrong and principles and so forth, and not really bring up the whole political thing because they're
Mm-hmm.
too young to understand that. Later on, okay, the kids are going to be able to kind of get what you're talking about with communism and so forth because they've seen that in their history classes, and they'll understand what you're saying. So
So when
you could do that at a 6th grade level with Animal Farm. It's just the way you teach it.
Yeah, so can you walk us through how you were trying to get us as the readers to go through your book? You were taking us through a history lesson, or were you taking us more through a thought process, and you wanted us to start expanding our minds about these restrictions?
The overall effect that I wanted to have with the book was raise awareness and spark further discussion. So, but to do that, I felt like I had to lay the groundwork of the history of like early book bans, and like this is not a brand new concept per se. Like in the last 10 years, books didn't just suddenly start getting challenged. It's been around a while, and this is how it's developed. And here's some of the early targets of bans and why they were targeted. And now suddenly we've got this big swell of activist groups trying to ban certain um, types of books. And I present some statistics on what states are leading in book bans so that I can say not so much, hey, red states are the real problem. I'm like saying red states means they're like Republican majority states. That's supposed to be conservative, and they're leading in book bans. Think about that what you will. I'm just putting it out there. Yes. Oh, that's one of those things I want the folks to read the book and think about that and maybe talk amongst themselves. And it's like, why is that? I don't want to tell them what to think, but maybe give them a reason to have something to think about.
Yes, because a lot of going into this, when I was looking at different articles to bring it up or to talk about in our discussion today, a lot of it seems like it just focuses on a heavy adult explicit
Mm-hmm.
material, but I feel like that is broad. It's kind of like how the Supreme Court doesn't really define what pornography is, but it says it when you see it. And that might have
Exactly.
changed, from To Kill a Mockingbird day and age to
Mm-hmm.
the N word is in songs now. So is it really that bad to see that in literature? So as the times are changing, and we can have the discussion about traditionalism later,
Right.
how have you been able to navigate whether or not it's just this definition of explicit material, or like we have Ruby Bridges's book,
Mm-hmm.
when she was the little girl during the civil rights era, or you hear in Texas they're banning some Frederick Douglass or Martin Luther King.
Um, hmm.
What I'm asking is, do you think that they really want to ban Martin Luther King and Frederick Douglass, or are the policies that they're pushing just so vague that now we get in civil rights leaders and more, rap artists and just
I
everybody
think
starting to get swept up under this?
I think when we look at the case with Ruby Bridges and Moms for Liberty in Tennessee, and certainly as I've mentioned several times, the bans or challenges on Toni Morrison's book and other Black authors. That's one of the categories that are the most frequent targets of book bans, or anything dealing with racial issues. And certainly the LGBTQ related books are a high target as well. The challenges as far as like with pornography and adult content is put out there as a very broad um, category. And certainly there are some books that have been found to be in libraries that, okay, I get it, that shouldn't be there, but they use those examples to make their case for these types of books, and how, you know, those themes are inappropriate, and then they lump a lot of other titles in with that
So they're
allegedly.
so you're saying they broad brushing the adult
Yeah,
explicit, but then
yeah.
all these racial titles are getting under there. They're
Hmm.
talking about, segregation or reconstruction, or,
Hmm.
Ruby Bridges, she actually, had the segregation, the army had to come down and do that. And maybe because
Right.
she put the N word on the cover of the book, but that's an actual photo of her. And,
See, the Ruby Bridges is, I think, where they were attacking Black history. Uh, with the Bluest Eye, I think it was a case of them painting with the broad brush and using that as, oh, that's got adult content in it too. And like, no, it doesn't. You know, it doesn't. That's not why you're attacking that book.
or if you read, Atticus in his case against, he actually helped the black guy who was on trial for something that he didn't do, but because the N word is flying around in
Hmm.
Kill a Mockingbird, it just was taken off. But you miss the father and how, he cared about his kids, and you miss all of that good content,
Right.
and you miss bigger parts of that just to take that book out of there just because you've seen, this pornographic book that might have been too graphic, or should at least, be
Right.
for 10,
And
10
with To Kill a Mockingbird, when it was going through its earliest challenges, you know, it's during the 60s, during the civil rights era. And one of the character that Atticus defended, Tom, you know, was falsely accused of raping a white woman, which it never happened. But obviously, the whole town was ready to go lynch the guy. Though that doesn't get brought up in when they were looking at that book.
Oh,
To
they try to skip over the part that should
Yeah, I
have been
mean
the part that you think that
that's
made
like,
people mad.
what's wrong? Are you getting a mirror held up a little too close?
Yeah, and
I
that's why you
mean,
banning the book. It's kind of weird because when you pick the books that are banned notoriously, like To Kill a
mhm.
Mockingbird, it's like, is this book? But then when you see some of the books that they've actually did challenge, like one dad, I guess he's on X, and he's going around to the school boards. When he reads the book, they shut him down because they don't want to hear it at the meeting, and he's like, "That's my point. That's the book that I don't think our kids should read." And I was wondering if, by the time they got to that point where he was at the meeting, maybe somebody should have stepped back before and looked at the curriculum. Like, why is that book part of the curriculum at
Hmm.
all anyway?
Right.
You see what I'm saying? Like,
Hmm.
as a homeschooling mom, I don't have to really deal with the system, but I do still have to choose books for my child. Like I was talking about Animal Farm and things like that. So, are we coddling our kids when we lump all these books, like you saying, the majority of books that are being banned are racial in nature and not necessarily sexually explicit in nature? So are we trying to hide history under the guise of protecting our kids from LGBTQ stuff? You see what I'm
I
where I'm
think
going with
that's the
it?
case, and I think there's some just fear of what people don't know and don't understand as well. I think in those cases, when you've got a small activist group that perpetuates these challenges and bans, it kind of plays on some of those folks that maybe there may not be so dead set on the ban per se, but not understanding it or knowing the whole story might stoke some fears to where they might be more supportive of the band without really understanding what the book is really about.
Yeah, I know. When I was at the collegiate level the first time, we got Frederick Douglass's biography, and I was having a different reaction to the biography than some of the other racial kids in the audience. But no one was like, "Hey, that we need to get rid of these books because she might feel some type of way about it." Because I was a minority in a non HBCU school. So in an HBCU school, you probably get all of those in African American studies or blah blah blah. But I was just in a regular American history class, and I was feeling some type of way, but nobody was like, save her feelings, because the slave codes, So
Man.
it's like,
And
I
see,
was
that's
like, yeah, been that book, but then no, not Dr. King. You see what I'm saying? How some of us are in a spot now.
and see that as I'm seeing these stories about different attitudes on campuses, and I'm like, this is night and day from what I experienced at UNC Chapel Hill, and that was from 91 to 95. And I mean, that whole environment was liberal arts in every sense of the liberal word.
You probably go
And
out on campus and see some sexually explicit. I'm
like
kidding, but
it was wide open in the fact that as far as like ideas and so forth, it was we there's a difference. They talk about a lot of the professors at these universities now are like kind of like indoctrinating the students, and I'm not there, so I don't see it, but that's the stories that I'm hearing. But my professors were like a lot of ex-hippies from the late 60s. This is like the early 90s. They were probably at Woodstock, or you're doing whatever stuff they did back in the late 60s, early 70s. It was a totally different kind of liberal attitude for them, where, okay, you've got an idea or a point to make, share it. Okay, now back it up, support your argument. You got a different one? Okay, let's hear what you got to say. And that's the kind of environment that I grew with in college. And now it's like, I don't like what you got to say, you got to not say it.
And that's what's weird to me, because a lot of the people who are actually, and we're talking a little bit more of the collegiate level. I know a lot of bands and stuff they're going elementary and
right.
secondary. I know it's a difference between the two, but these people also are the ones who are saying we don't want our kids to even participate in the college because a lot of the colleges are left leaning. And I'm thinking, well, I had a very left leaning pro President Johnson professor, a gray hair, great guy, but I was like, nah, when we was in his class, but we was able to debate that in the class. And I'm wondering if the students are going to miss out on a little bit of that as some of these books get swept up in the ban. I'm not saying that some of these sexually explicit books, I want to make that clear. I'm not saying that, little kids need to be seeing adult stuff. But what I am saying is, as people are trying to look for more books and take down more books, one side might start taking down books too. We're going to end up with a lot of books start coming off the shelves. And as you know, my library is behind me and your library is behind you. Are we, going to have this backlash, or is it going to backfire with all this back and forth?
I think, when you restrict more and more books at the grade school level all the way through high school, for those kids that do go to college, I mean, it's kind of setting them, back quite a bit. I mean, you develop a lot of good analytical skills when you study a lot of these books. And when you keep getting that watered down to only the safe stuff, safe in the stuff that takes you out of your comfort zone, then you're losing a lot of that. You get soft in that regard. And, when they do go off to college or even in the workforce, people underestimate how those skills that you build through critical thinking help you in any job, any profession.
I was going to ask you about, towards the end of the book, you said you were raising awareness. What is your call to action, or what is your gleaning for the reader to feel or to think about this more deeply? I know you said you wanted to get us to open our mind and get an awareness, but can you expound on that just a little bit more?
What I want people to realize is that that banning anything, restricting anything is probably the least effective and one of the most harmful courses of action you can take in this area. And again, I have to qualify that with there is certain types of material that doesn't need to be in schools, but much of what's being challenged, I don't think falls into that category, but I digress. What I want people to understand is that you're better off competing with a different idea or an alternative. Like here's a different book to you for required reading, as opposed to this book. Instead of just saying, okay, no, well, they don't like it, take that book away. That where does that stop? And then somebody's going to not like another book, and then somebody will challenge this book. So get away from the banning and just get involved with what's being done in the classrooms, education wise, and present an alternative plan to restricting a book from the library.
I would personally say that we need to show up more. A lot of
Mhm.
the parents are saying that just pull the books out, pull your kids out. I am an advocate of homeschooling, but everybody cannot do that. So for the
Right.
parents that have to, I know somebody that's really a good friend, and me and her was going back. She said, I can't pull my daughter out. And I was like,
Mhm.
okay. So now what do we do for those people? And I was suggesting, get involved with the curriculum. More conservatives need, or people just thinking like this, need to step up and be teachers, be the college professors, be at these meetings when they're deciding what books to read. Ask questions about, how does this affect my child's curriculum? Does my child need to really learn this? I think a lot of the banning and all this stuff is because people weren't involved. So people who were involved was able to pretty much do
Exactly. They
whatever
didn't
they
have
want.
anybody challenging them, so they were able to get their
Yeah.
agenda.
And I think instead of just outright, okay, y'all doing this, I want banned, we should be having more, your person here, your person there, y'all duke it out intellectually, and then we
Hmm.
come to a conclusion, okay, this is what we need to do. And I think a lot of people don't really have time for that, so they just want to take the book down and keep it moving. But now you got new authors coming through, these publishers pumping out books. So be a publisher, open up your own publishing company.
Yeah,
What is
your
some
alternative market, so to speak,
Yeah, or media company, so to speak,
or
podcasting,
both.
right? That's why, I mean, that is why I started my media collection, my media book collection, because I was like, okay, what else is out there? So I offered that. What are you are offering parents who are worried, who are listening to this, like, I do want that book banned. I don't want that in my kids' education. I don't want none of that stuff.
And
So
there's a
what
lot more parents that are like that than people think.
yeah, solace that, hey, your kid can handle some stuff, but we get you on the other stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think any good parent knows their kid better than anybody else. So that's where it starts. Anytime you have a problem with what is going on in your child's school, whatever grade level they're at, or if you just have questions, there should be a parent teacher conference, at some point, so you can go have those discussions and keep that going forward. And I say, I grew up with that. I mean, we had those on a regular basis.
Have you
Just as a check in.
have you ran into any of these kind of concerns as a parent, from just a parenting standpoint, with your son being a little bit older than our children? How have you handled that? Just from the discussion we're having today.
Whenever all throughout his school, there would always be an open house where we could go meet all the teachers, even all the way through high school. So we had a chance to go in and see what was in the classroom, talk to the teacher, what are your plans to teach this? And even in high school, we'd go in there, and in one of his English teachers, here's my book library, everything I've got. And I'm looking at that, I'm like, that's pretty cool, but then I come from a background of where I'm used to that, like not having a lot of restrictions. So when I see these books, like like something popular contemporary fiction or something like that in there, or these other books like Slaughterhouse-Five or 1984, I'm like, hey, that's pretty cool. This teacher's a little more progressive in a good way, as far as like pushing it and challenging the students, with so that I didn't have any problems in my son's coursework throughout his years in grade school and high school. So,
Thank you.
and I didn't have anything like that when I was coming up through school, where my mom was like, "Oh, you ain't reading that book." I'd go home, tell her everything that was going on in school. Like, "Oh, we're reading this book about blah 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 blah." And she's all right. You got any homework? Get it done.
Before I was just jumping in, I was gonna say that is getting pushed back when people are saying, add the Bible to the school, and I was just like, it's some stuff in there that like King Solomon just be getting it in. So
Okay, it's funny you bring that up. My senior year in high school, and this course was around for a while, but my senior year in high school, I took a course that was a two-part course. The first 9 weeks was one half, and the next 9 weeks was the other half. It was the Bible as literature and Greek mythology. So the first half of the year, we're studying the Bible as literature, and that consisted of the teacher getting up there, and we would go through different books of the Bible, and she would read it through, and she would do like you might get in Sunday church where it's a sermon, but it was like, okay, here's what's, and she would analyze it like we're studying a novel. So, but it's the Bible, and it's in a public school in a very heavily red county school system. And nobody had a problem with it. Nobody was like, "Oh, mom, they're talking about the Bible at school."
yeah, and now we might get a tit for tat because they're like, "Oh, you been in our books. We will come after your favorite one."
Mm-hmm.
They separation of church and state, and so now we're getting into 1A stuff, and we getting into religion, and then it's getting spicy. So that's what I'm saying. I feel like they went in maybe with the most basic intentions, and with some of these policies that are vague, like I was pointing out, Texas putting Martin Luther King under the bus. A lot of people know his, I Have a Dream, but they don't know about all of his letters and a lot of other stuff he had said. And so that's where we get in kind of the lines blurred of what is and what isn't acceptable at these elementary and middle school and high school levels. That's also bleeding into college a little bit.
Right.
But so your book is actually to bring awareness and let people know, hey, this is going on. You might want to pay attention to it before, we go down these slippery slopes that we have brought up. What did you feel you got out of the writing process as you saw your own book coming together and you saw the book getting ready for publishing?
Well, it was kind of cool as I was doing the research for like the last part of it, I was gathering different statistics on where a lot of the book bans came from and where they were the heaviest concentrated. And that's where it really hit home when I saw those stats of who led the country in the most book bans and saw that compared to the lowest literacy rates. I was like, wow, it was just kind of an eye opener to me. And, it did to me what I would hope it would do to the readers. It made me think about the way things are, considering the data that I had uncovered and what that could mean going forward.
So you were pushing your own preconceived, you had an idea of how the book was going to go, but as you were doing research for it, you were opening your own mind.
Yeah, and a lot of my preconceptions were what I'd grown up with hearing about book bans in the past. Oh, people, objectionable content in the book, language in the book, and that sort of thing. So then it gets like a debate over, well, is that rough language or is it not? Is that rough material or is it not? But now you see there's a whole bigger, excuse me, agenda out there as far as, who it's affecting, and so forth. So it kind of it broadened my whole thinking over the whole book. So as I got through that and doing more research and getting to the last part of the book, it was more than just talking about groups arguing about whether or not, a book had bad language or bad content.
I think that was a good conclusion. Do you think people that are leading the book bans will find your book interesting, or do you think they will feel some type of way about you bringing up this topic?
It depends. I mean, how much notoriety it gets, to be honest.
I'm trying my best.
I'm like,
I put it out there.
Look, I'm looking at that. I'm sitting in those spaces, and then I'm listening to Dr. A go in on Tiffany. I'm like,
my book will get me in trouble.
My book talks about y'all a little bit.
My book talks. Oh yeah, you're talking about when we have our conversations on X and Miss Tiffany Justice from Moms for Liberty. And
hey, I mean, I don't agree with anything what she's saying, but I'll give her this. She stood 10 toes down on that nonsense. If you're going to wear that suit, wear it the full way.
For a reason. It is called the Thunderdome, and it's every Monday over on X at 11
Yeah,
a.m. hosted by Sonny Johnson. Y'all go over there if you roll your sleeves up. Let's go. It's an
let's do it.
ideological battle, so I love it because it makes us think, and that's what we're trying to do here. We're trying to get everybody to understand the social, economic, political way we can retransform our country. And I'm so glad that you were able to come, just drop by, Greg. We appreciate everything you do for us at Iconic. I want to give you your flowers before we, do anything else. And I want everybody to also know that they can pick up your book. Where can they find you at? And just tell us a little bit of what you're doing with your Substack and what's your plans for the future.
Yeah, you can find me at GW Bulla on X. Trying to get better about not saying Twitter, but nobody knows what I'm talking about when I say X.
Yeah, you'd be like X, formerly known as Twitter or something like
Yeah,
that.
and then you can find my books at greg.w.bulla at gumroad.com. So yeah, check me out there. Check me out on my Substack. I'm going to get a little more into that. Writing this last book kind of took me off my schedule. And I've got a new book. I'm going to start working, doing the pre-writing and work on that here during the holidays, and that'll probably be out sometime next year.
Oh, we got another book. Yay.
Fiction, yeah, we're going
Doesn't
into
stop
fiction.
us.
I'm my little. You can see my shirt here, Midnight Special. So yeah, I'm an old head, retro person like that. So that's where I'm going to start kind of going back and telling some stories from like back in the day and so forth like that. So yeah, check that out. I'll still have some history stuff and other social related material on Substack.
Awesome. And I'm also going to have some cross posts. I'm so technology illiterate, and I just found out that you can cross post people's articles that you find interesting over on Substack. So sometimes I might, for premium subscribers, if you upgrade today over at misspinkythoughts.substack.com, you'll get some more podcasts like today's replay. You'll get some of these articles, and you'll also get my book Iconic for $5 a month, $50 a year at a 2-month discount. And as always, we ask you to do everything. You're going to be iconic. We think we had such a great show
Visit
today.
the merch shop.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. If we can get you guys to subscribe, share the page. I'm actually going to start adding the merch shop to the bottom of the YouTube. You see it on everybody's YouTube at the bottom, but I need to get some more subscribers. So if you guys can share this, like this post, tell a friend, tell anybody, I could greatly appreciate it. We do have a merch shop. It's Miss Pinky Thoughts. .spreadshirt.com. You can go over there and get discounts. You got hoodies, t-shirts, sweatshirts, all kinds of good stuff over there. We got our holiday collection. We collecting donations to give away free books. If you would like to help give a free book away this month for $10 or more, you can go to paypal.me/MRSPINKY85. And all of these links are at our Substack. At the top of the page, it says Iconic. And right underneath, it has every single thing that I mentioned today. So you can just click, and everything is going to be down at the and below in the show notes. As always, I enjoyed this conversation, Greg. We could talk all night, but I'm not going to hold you much longer. Thank you guys for joining me for a new episode of Mrs. Pinky Thoughts. I'm your host, Nicole Pinkston, and you guys have a good night.